Thank you, Professor Dubey, for your kind words. And I would like really to express my gratitude to all of you, and especially to the organizers for the opportunity given to me to share my experience, and particularly the last report to the United Nations General Assembly on the need for regulating privatization in education and preserving education as a public good. I am very encouraged by your support and involvement, and as Professor Dubey says, it has also been for me most gratifying that very huge international non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations, intellectual community, they have had interaction with me, and they are absolutely very actively engaged in promoting these such perspective and these thematic concerns which are worldwide, which have become worldwide phenomena. When I presented my report to the General Assembly on 27th October, I was a bit apprehensive, saying that somebody will criticize, because all the states were present. Nobody criticized, all of them supported, and there was a strong engagement asking me how to take this process further in regulating privatization. This is because today, as you know, we are confronted with few very key global challenges. First and foremost is the challenge of equality of opportunity in general. And in the present discussions on post-2015 development agenda, what should be the development agenda for future for the international community, this is very, very important issue in face of the whole international community. And a key element in this is the equality of opportunity in education, which is a general principle, fundamental principle, enshrined in all international human rights treaties. Now, for example, the Oxfam report on how we need to preserve the essential function of the state in terms of public services, and they emphasize on, among other things, education very highly, because they feel and say that we are heading towards social tension and social explosion unless we restore essential public function of the state to counter growing inequalities in the world. In a world where 1% of the population owning 80% of the wealth, more than 1.3 billion people victim of extreme poverty. So the key issues are those of equity, social justice. These are the two fundamental principles of the whole United Nations system. Whole United Nations system is built around the vision and concept of social justice and development based on human rights. And when we see the reality, we have a world which is totally detrimental to these fundamental values of United Nations system and ideals of education as enshrined in international human rights conventions. For instance, I just mentioned equality of opportunity, but in fact, we all know, it's pointed out very often, that even today millions of children are just deprived of education, and greater concern is with those who are marginalized, who are excluded. And therefore the social exclusion in education and marginalization in education, and as I mentioned, particularly the access to education by poor all over the world, is a very, very critical issue. And therefore, in terms of this explosive demands for education everywhere, because more and more parents realize that education is future, they have to, at no matter what cost, impart education to their children, and governments are not in a position to cope with this phenomena fully, and therefore, under circumstances, the privatization has mushroomed. So that lot of private providers have come in play in the field of even basic education and primary education to provide education to those who cannot get access in general, because governments cannot respond to the growing demands of universalized system of education. And this phenomena, unfortunately, remains uncontrolled and unregulated when we look at the human rights framework. For instance, In all these international conventions, human rights conventions, UNESCO's Convention Against Discrimination in Education, International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, the Convention on Rights of the Child, and so on and so forth, the principle of equality of opportunity in education for all is a fundamental principle. And all these conventions very clearly lay down that no discrimination should be made by states on the basis of social origin or economic status, and most importantly, the Convention on Rights of the Child, which is the most widely ratified instrument accepted by all states, stipulates specifically that no discrimination should be made on the basis of property. And we today confront a situation where if you are propertied, you get access to education, very expensive good, and if you are not, you remain deprived of education. In any case, you remain deprived of chances of education in a world where there is a growing phenomenon of mercantilization of privatization. Because this trend of privatization, because it is unregulated, has led to a number of issues, such as, for example, making huge profit out of education. I analyzed very thoroughly the available jurisprudence, including in India, and fortunately, there are a number of court decisions which point out to the need. India we have very vast jurisprudence. The first country, I think in early 90s, there was a decision by Jeevan Reddy saying that capitation fee is unconstitutional because education is a public function of the state. And today all of you know how much there is this abuse of education system to just make money. Even recently, there have been a number of decisions to that effect when it comes to admission to engineering colleges, medical colleges. And most of these institutions have a number of problems. One problem is that it is unregulated. Therefore, you can mint money, the education has, most unfortunately, become the best business because it is totally unregulated, it's mercantilized. And then the other thing, which is deplorable, is the corruption in education. I am very happy that UNESCO is here because UNESCO brought out a very good report on corruption, and I was so fascinated. And the title of the report itself is Corrupt Schools. I am quoting the title: Corrupt Schools, Corrupt Universities, What to Do. And that corruption is hidden much more widely prevalent in privatized system, because what privatized school education providers do is not to provide honest accounts, because there is no strict regulation and sanctity, but inflated. For instance, we take teachers deployment. Now teachers should be qualified. This is essential condition of quality. But in most of the private system, the teachers are known to be unqualified because they say we can't get qualified, it's a pretext. So you deploy for the time being even contractual teachers. And then I know it that many of them provide training which is totally scant, 1 week training, and then that's it. And teachers are made to sign false bills that I received so much money, whereas it is not real payment. And this is known phenomena. And I cited this in my report. And I am very happy to share with you that when I presented my report, first country to support very strongly was Pakistan. They say, yes, you said very well, these teachers think we know it. And we know all the abusive practices, so tell us how best to control. And provide us examples, and I did provide a lot of examples. Now I cited this again to make the point that the challenges of privatization are, and the impact of privatization is, in terms of human rights law, very serious. First, as I said, universal access. If at all, it's not that privatization is helping in education, but they are helping more in violating the principle of equality of opportunity and non-discrimination. Because very serious studies have shown that because of privatization, those who are marginalized, those who are poor, those who do not have money or not are well-to-do or wealthy, they remain deprived of the system. So it has consequences on the one key dimension of right to education, that is the entitlement. That everybody is universally entitled to receive basic education. And that is not so. And the states are failing and private people are stepping in. And this phenomena demonstrates very clearly that although private providers could supplement education, but they are in fact supplanting. Because the governments cannot realize right to education or any human right overnight. So spirit of all human rights is progressive realization. And pending that progressive realization, if there is a privatization, that is acceptable provided it is regulated, but that is not the situation. So there is serious negative impact on privatization, on entitlement as a universal principle. But other principle which I already mentioned, that is that of the empowerment. You may get to school, but then what do you learn? And we all know today's Times of India editorial, yesterday's and day before yesterday's news, which is not unique to India, which is widespread all over the world, that you have 8th class, 6th class, and you are just absolutely in terms of quality nil. When I went to several countries, everywhere I look into all these aspects and teachers, and I ask students, which is your textbook, can you read this sentence, can you sign your name? 6, 7-year-old girls and boys, they can't sign their name. And the teaching profession, which is the teacher's status, is the key pillar of quality. The International UNESCO's Convention on Recommendation on Status of Teachers of 1996 and other conventions are very clear that teaching profession should be a profession with professional status, government should respect, and it should have social esteem. And this is something which is totally lacking. Today, unfortunately, teachers are not respected. This professional status is not preserved. So we have lack of professional respect for status and complete lack, I would say, of social esteem. And that is why nobody wants to go to teaching profession if you have anything else. And again, allow me to share my personal experience. When I visit countries, I ask students in my interaction, raise hands or tell me how many of you want to become teacher. And very few. And I said, why is this so? He said, teacher is not attractive, it's violence, there is no respect, no money, no career. So why should we go for something which is like that? That shows how much teaching profession is neglected. And thus, there are huge challenges of quality in terms of privatization. More so, because human rights law, right to education particularly, is very clear in terms of essential objectives of education. That education should promote development of human personality. It should promote universal values of peace, democracy, of mutual understanding, appreciation of each other's culture differences, and so on and so forth. And this core mission of education, the core objectives, are violated by privatization. In the sense that instead of furthering the humanistic mission of education, privatization is mere instrumental, that you teach little bit of mathematics or whatever, and areas are very selective in terms of commerce, management, and so on and so forth. So there is no regulation from the state to ensure their legal responsibility, internationally, that education should meet the essential objectives laid down in international human rights treaties, and also the fundamental principle of education and right to education, that education is a public good. I very often cite, and I will like you to bear in mind and cite, the 1994 United States Supreme Court decision, which is very famous, Board versus Brown of Education. And that decision, Supreme Court of the United Nations said, a public education system is a primary responsibility of the state. In a very recent decision, the Louisiana Supreme Court said that same thing, saying that school vouchers and those kind of schemes are unconstitutional and must be finished. Because unfortunately, the private providers have spread these various false conceptions, including inducing governments to introduce vouchers that way, okay, we pay money to the poor people to exclude that they go wherever they go and get education. And this is absolutely unacceptable in human rights law. It is totally contrary to social justice and equity and principle of education as public good. And I am very happy to say this, that UNESCO has been supporting this concept of education as a public good, because UNESCO's mission essentially is to promote ideals of humanity and education for democracy, rule of law, and for justice. And therefore, UNESCO constantly supports the concept of education as a public good. The last ministerial conference of UNESCO in Oman, where I had also the privilege to participate, adopted a consensus, and the Declaration of Oman, the outcome document very clearly says, and I quote it, and I am very happy this is so, that preserving education as a public good and quality education is essential function of state. And we have to propagate these ideals as such. So I will come to 2-3 other points and then conclude. I'm sorry if I take more time. But the most essential phenomena and development which we must today try to understand is the responsibility of the government to invest in education as public function as such. And in fact, what privatization has done is to
induce disinvestment.
Because governments say, and unfortunately they feel that okay, we are not investing, but there's so much of privatization coming in that why should we invest? We support privatization. So another abusive practice is that instead of assuming your function as a government